Hello Tech Nottingham. I'm really looking forward tonight to talking to you about the IndieWeb movement, owning your data and being the change you want to see in the web. I thought I'd kick us off by talking about what I'm about to talk to you about. So we're going to start by defining what IndieWeb is, and going forwards into the talk we'll understand a bit more what it's actually all about. Next, this isn't deja vu, we are going to talk about what the IndieWeb is and the subtle differences that are between the two terms and why you may be confused. Next, we'll talk about some of the principles that guide the IndieWeb. So these are things that generally folks in either naming convention of the IndieWeb community will be abiding by. We'll also talk about some of the building blocks and the ecosystem that is around some of these IndieWeb principles and that can support you in becoming an IndieWeb citizen. We'll also talk about how you can actually get started with the community. In August, I did a lightning talk at Tech Nottingham titled Joining the IndieWeb or Why It Takes Me Between 5 Minutes and 6 Months to Reply to Your Tweet. This was kind of a humorous take on what the IndieWeb was, and I thought envisioned quite nicely why people see some odd things from me. So why I got involved with the IndieWeb was out of my love for self-hosting. So I used to run a server which had multiple services on it for tooling that I wanted to use. So for instance, I use things like Wallabag, which is a read it later service, which I still use, but I now pay the actual project maintainers to host it for me. Not just for me, but for lots of people. And as part of that, I've always been quite into owning my own stuff, not just because it gives me a chance to play around with stuff and to understand a bit more how things work, but because it gives me some ownership. And so it was, I think I was in Italy in 2018 on holiday. And of course, what everyone does on holiday is they go reading through lots of people's technical blogs about some of the cool stuff they're doing. It's not really. It was quite a sad moment for me. But I spent a good amount of that holiday reading through a couple of people who are very prominent figures and the founders of the IndieWeb community, and looking at some of the things they were doing, and I was like, this is really cool. Like, they've built so much stuff just because they wanted to, and because they've got a thing that they're like, actually, I want that for myself. I want to be able to easily post to my website and post, say, an article from my phone or from an internet kiosk, something like that. It also is all about, well, they wanted to own certain bits of data. So Aaron, one of these members, he tracks everything he eats and drinks. Now, there may not be a point to it. Aaron finds use out of it, but it just got me thinking, like, there are some really interesting things that people are doing. They're building some cool tooling that's kind of just for them. And I was like, yeah, this is really nice. So then in, I think it was March 2019, there was a talk at Notts.js. And that was a really good one as well, because Josh did a really good talk about some of the technicalities of it. And I was like, you know what? I've been saying about this for months that I want to look into it. And after Josh's talk, I took the plunge and started getting involved in it. Now fast forward to August 2020, and I'm presenting a talk like this, which is a separate talk, and we can talk about this later. But it was quite funny because there was a time where it took me 6 months to reply to someone's tweet, and that's like not really a good selling point for all this owning your data, but I thought it was pretty cool, and that's why I got into it. So if you go to my website tonight, you will see a very different view, because hopefully I've posted some more things to it. but this is as it is today. And you can see a few different types of content here. So at the top, I'm RSVPing to an event. Below, I'm replying to someone's tweet, who is also replying to someone else. And then I've bookmarked someone's blog post. Now these are 3 different distinct types of content. And these are the sorts of things that I use my website for. So traditionally, when you say, come and view my website, it's generally going to be like a portfolio, show off some of the cool things I'm doing. It will have some blog posts, but you don't think, oh yeah, I'm storing all my replies to Twitter, or I'm tracking everything I eat. But the IndieWeb is all about pushing those sorts of boundaries and making your personal website yourself and using it for whatever you want to. So we're going to do some audience participation. Now, I thought this wouldn't work great, but I'm going to bet that it's going to work really nicely, because right now, in real time, in real human life, I'm going to be posting on Slack while I'm doing this preamble, and I'm going to be writing these questions, and I would love if some of you lovely folks could reply on Slack with emoji just to say yes or no, just for a good show of hands. So hands up if you post any content to something like Twitter, Medium, The Practical Dev, Facebook, basically anything. So any content anywhere. Hands up if you've got a personal website. Hands up if you post content on your personal website, because I know there are lots of us, not naming any names, who will generally have a website and their last post was a few years ago saying, oh, I've redone my website, I'm going to post more, which I know, it happens. So what about, including those, what about if you post stuff on your website? And then finally, hands up if you've heard about the IndieWeb or know what it's about. Cool, so I thought we'd take a second just to reflect on, well, why are we all here? So aside from the fact that it's Tech Nottingham, it's an awesome event, an awesome community, this is the abstract of the talk. So it's a pretty bold statement, and I thought it was quite a nice little hook to get people involved and interested. This was originally pitched to a free and open source software conference, hence the very strong free and open source software, but I feel like it would work with a lot of our tech community. So, what actually is the IndieWeb? So as I mentioned, there's a little bit of difference between IndieWeb with caps and IndieWeb lowercase. So this is a really good post that I recommend reading from Murray about their experience 1 year in the IndieWeb. And so I've put a bit more emphasis on this, but Murray talks about the fact that generally when you talk to people about the IndieWeb, they say, really you just need to do 3 things. Have a website, own your URL, and make it available to people. But the difficulty here is that actually, and Murray puts it really nicely, that's what IndieWeb lowercase is. Then there's the IndieWeb movement, which is kind of what this talks about, as well as IndieWeb lowercase, which is actually a movement to try and get us away from the corporate internet and to be more of a political movement and political statement to get away from these silos. The other thing that in the same post Murray's summed up really nicely is the IndieWeb as a thing, regardless of casing, is also like a toolkit. So what we've done is we've built up many different standards, many different open solutions to things, which are all interchangeable and usable bit by bit. What we commonly see in the community is that, and Murray comments on, is you'll see people who say, oh yeah, I'm now IndieWeb, and then about 6 months later they're like, I am no longer IndieWeb, it was too much to maintain. And that sort of burnout is driven by people feeling that they have to do everything. And really, the IndieWeb lowercase is all about just vibing, just doing what you want and having a good time on your website, and that's it. You can add some extra things if you want. You don't have to go whole hog with, I want to make a political statement, I want to move everything off all these silos. It can just be, I want to be able to follow my friends' feeds. I want to be able to follow their blog posts and their posts on Twitter from the same reader. It's things like that that actually, if you think about it as a means to an end and a toolkit, it works a lot nicer. One of the big things for the IndieWeb is ownership. So the most important is owning your identity. So by that, we don't mean, well, you are your identity, so you kind of already own this. It's trying or striving to maintain a single place that people go to get in touch with you or to see your thoughts. So for instance, for me, it's www.jbt.me. If people want to know what I'm thinking at that moment, they can go there. They may then link out to my Twitter, my GitLab, my not my Facebook. I think my LinkedIn's on there as well. But every interaction with me should be reached by my URL. Now, that doesn't have to be hosted on my own thing. That could link to a Tumblr. It could be to WordPress.com. It could be to Wix or Squarespace. It's just that people go to my URL and they know it's me. Another big thing of ownership is owning your data. So I mentioned things like owning tweets and what you eat and drink, but it can be anything. And also, it doesn't have to be public. So this is just owning it. For instance, you're not going to want to publish your very sensitive healthcare data to your personal website so anyone can read it, unless you're up with that, but chances are you're not going to. But this can also include things like your thoughts. So instead of your tweets, you post them to your site. Do you work out? What sort of art do you post? And it can all be yours. And most importantly, it's on your site first. So by making sure it's on your site first, you own that and you get the best search engine optimization. You get the most warm fuzzies because it's yours and you can point someone to that URL instead of someone else's. This isn't really too much of a thing, but if you really want, you can put it all on your own infrastructure and then you own like the physical thing that's running in your house that's serving everything else. That's pretty cool. So it's also about breaking free from the silos. So this is the IndieWeb in caps. And this is saying that no matter how open a platform originally seems, it's unfortunately not going to be for long, which is a very pessimistic but also somewhat realistic view. Often these open platforms will lead to being user hostile and locked down or inaccessible, or they'll just be shut down and you'll be stuffed. So yeah, we want to put it on our own URLs, put it on our own platforms that we own, we build, and that are subscribing to open standards. So Brad Frost has a really good post about why you should write on your own website. And in this post, Brad talks about the fact that when you write for another publication, if you're lucky, you get like a little avatar at the beginning and end of the post, but that's it. People remember the publication, but probably not your name. Now, in fact, depending on the publication, you may not even get that. So there's a very popular Java website called Baildon. And if you want to get paid for the words that you write for them, you have to rescind your authorship rights, so it looks like it's just published by the site. So there's some really awesome content out there that people don't even get the credit for. They get a bit of money, and that's nice and an alternative, but you don't get to own it. Whereas if you post on your own site, yes, you may not get the same number of hits as like a site like Baildon or CSS Tricks, but you do also get all the credit, and it's yours, and you can build it how you want and make it look how it looks. And yeah, because it's your content, you should have a choice about what to do with it. So Yahoo Groups had a big announcement a couple of years ago, where they were like, ooh, yeah, we're shutting down. You've got 3 months to get everything off. And that's like a huge amount of community building and just tons of content that people are going to have to get out. And the folks who are running these communities aren't necessarily the most technical. So that's like quite a big thing to say, oh, you got 3 months to understand how to do it, move to another platform, get everyone up to speed. It's quite difficult. There was also quite a stir in the online adult world where Tumblr recently, again 2 years ago, banned pornography on the platform, which definitely caused some stirs around the internet. The 500 pixels online image platform wouldn't allow you to use Creative Commons licensed art or photography, which meant that you had to end up giving 500 pixels some money based on those things, because it had to be commercial, and that sucks. And then recently, an acquisition of the Spectrum community chat software was sunset pretty much as soon as GitHub acquired it, which again, it's like, well, you've just been acquired, and now everyone has to move to what has been argued to be an inferior tool, and that is, again, that sucks. On the IndieWeb wiki, there is a lot of good documentation around all the different sites that have died over the years. I very much recommend a read just to see what sort of things there are and see if there's anything that you can think of. So, given we want to own our content, and we've spent so long building that content and writing it and creating it, that putting it on a platform where the platform is being run in a capitalist society, therefore money is going to be quite an important thing for them. So they're probably going to be thinking, well, maybe we'll like sell the user's privacy, maybe we'll sell their happiness, or we'll like flood the page with ads and reduce the visibility of the content. Or they'll just want to get all your attention by trying to maximize the amount of time you spend on the platform. So we've seen this with things like Facebook, where just everything is on it. It's not just, oh, let me talk to my friends. It's, oh, I'll play a game, or oh, I'll check the news. And because you're on that platform, they're going to want to maximize that, and they're probably going to take advantage of dark UX patterns and things like that to maximize the amount of time that they can get your eyeballs on their screen, because chances are not only is that going to benefit them, because then you spend less time on other platforms, but also it means that they can do other things with that time, like sell you ads. So one of the solutions is to be your own platform. So this allows us to avoid abiding by other people's guidelines, such as, so not in terms of hate speech and things like that, I mean more in terms of if you're finding that the site isn't very accessible or that the platform doesn't do a thing that you want, you can just do it. Because you're your own platform as well, you can revolve it around you and the things that you want to do. And that's really important because, like, if you want a feature and no one else in the world's going to care about it, chances are the big social network or the big platform isn't going to build it, but you can because you are your own platform and you can build your own stuff. And because there is a huge community around it, doesn't mean that you yourself need to understand how to build everything. It's that you can get support and get things set up using these open standards. But I think most importantly, it's just like not accepting the state of everything and just believing that everything that we've currently got is fine, because it's not. And there's so much more and so much useful stuff that we can do. Especially like the amount of times I've seen people complain about Twitter's chronological feed resetting back to the algorithm that Twitter want to use. There's things like that people just accept, and they'll constantly flip it back, and they'll constantly flip it back. But if you've got your own stuff, you can do that better. So similar to how free and open source software is a political statement, this is also a political statement, because you're saying to all these platforms, I don't want to use you. I want to do something that is more collaborative, better for everyone, and yeah, that's a thing. Okay, so what are the principles that guide the IndieWeb community? Some of these you'll recognise. Own your data. And as mentioned, it doesn't always have to be public. So it can just be for your own usage. So I'm going to tell you a story about one of the most useful pieces of data that I've owned, which is my RSVPs, which you saw earlier. So currently on my site, I've got 308 RSVPs, which include historical, and this is because, so definitely in the before times, before the pandemic, I attended a lot of in-person meetups and conferences. But even now, I'm attending things online and trying to keep track of why didn't I get anything done like last week? Oh yeah, it's because I was in 4 meetups. Things like that were quite hard to see because I used to use the meetup calendar that was built into Meetup to keep an eye on what was coming up next. But because they didn't have historical data, that made it a little bit awkward, so I couldn't think about, okay, well, what was I doing then? So what I did was, I was like, you know what? I'm going to do it better. I'm going to store these RSVPs myself, and I'm going to create my own calendar that I can then subscribe to. And the best thing about this is I then sent this to my family, and I was like, instead of asking me how busy I am this week, here you go, done. But also, not just my family, but I was able to share it with colleagues and say, hey, if you ever fancy coming to a meetup, here's a list of everything I'm going to. Let me know if you want to tag along and we can go. Things like that. There's also a ton of other stuff you can own. So I'm keeping track of my step count at the moment. You can do things like all your photos, any dietary information, what games are you playing, what have you listened to recently, what you're watching, all sorts of things. And there's so much more that you yourself would probably be interested in. Yeah, you just have to think, is that actually worth it? So with all this data, where public, where available for other people to view, one of the principles is to use and publish visible data. So first of all, and most importantly, it needs to be human readable. because at the end of the day, the squishy meat bags are going to be on your site, and will want to be able to read it. So you don't want to just go for big blobs of JSON on your site, because that's not helpful. But you'd also want it to be machine readable, because machines power most of the web, and they can also do very interesting things, like tally up how many times I've walked up a flight of stairs this week, stuff like that. And this is where microformats come in. So this is a standard that we'll talk about a little bit later, which is all about how do you mark up human readable words with machine parsable markup in a way that doesn't repeat too much, and feels a bit nicer. It's also really important to make what you need, also referred to as scratcher itch, because we all have problems that we want to solve, and instead of thinking about a generic solution that any imaginary unhelpful user is going to want, think about you yourself and say, I want to solve this exact problem, so I am going to solve it. I'm going to be a selfish human, and I am going to solve the thing I want. And that then means that you don't waste a load of time building for a generic case. You build something that you can use straight away. And if people are interested, they can build their own. You can rework it at that point, but don't start with the generic solution, unless you want to. Yeah, and what is actually annoying you? So I run the Homebrew website club in Nottingham, and I used to get a load of questions around, oh, when is it again? So at this point, I was publishing it to my website. I said, you know what? I've recently played around with calendars through my website. So I'm going to create a calendar feed, and then people can just import that, and then they know what's coming and when. And again, because we are building things, we should also be using what we've made. So instead of saying, you know what, here's the thing, everyone else, you go and use it. Actually, we should think about making sure that we build the confidence in the things that we've built ourselves. Because there's no point asking other people to battle test our own software. We should be the ones willing to do this. Those of you that all know me know that I like documenting things, so I publish a lot of blog posts about some of the things that I work on. And so this, but unsarcastically, I thoroughly recommend this, just generally, but also as part of like the IndieWeb community. It's all about saying, you know what, I've just done a thing, so I'm going to write about it. I'm going to let people know that I've just done it, so they can be like, oh, okay, that's cool, we know someone else is doing it now. Alternatively, ooh, I've been meaning to do that for a while, now they've just done it and reminded me, I'm going to do it as well, which I've had happen at least once based off one of the posts that I've written. I've had someone reach out and say, thanks, that reminded me that I need to do that, and that's cool. It's also a great way of proving that you know something, because by documenting or teaching someone else, you really validate that that has been done correctly. And it's also a great way of rubber duck debugging, because you can say, ooh, actually, that thing that I've just said doesn't make sense, so why would I have actually done it that way? And if you're feeling comfortable about it, sharing it under a free or open source license so others can use it, or running it as a platform that others can use, is also super helpful, so we can learn from it and use it and share it. Something that I really like about the community is we don't work to build a load of standards and then 2 years down the line we implement it and we're like, oh yeah, that never would be usable. Instead, it's built of implementations drive a standard. So there's a lot of open collaboration. There's a lot of people saying, ooh, I'm trying it this other way, and this actually works a lot nicer. And thinking about the users, because like a lot of these are technical solutions, they need to be usable by people. Otherwise, it's just not going to work for like our parents or folks who are not as technically inclined. There's also trying to build things in a modular way, so you can have a platform agnostic platform. So you can build like your website, but you can use lots of different things to build that. You also want small pieces loosely joined, so you can reuse things, similar to the Unix philosophy of a small tool doing one thing well. Similarly, you want lots of little things that can be combined to do something awesome. There's also building for the long web. So this is, I think, a bit of a stretch. But something like, can we actually write our software or build our websites? They're like 20 years they're still running, like the Space Jam website. And this is quite a nice alternative to some of the stuff we do in like free and open source communities, where everyone's like, oh, well, we've got so many different forks, try and pool resources and do them together. In the IndieWeb, it's the opposite of that, and it's everyone should write it themselves, because it gives us more implementers, so there's more diversity of actually that doesn't make sense, or what about if? And it also means that we just have lots of solutions, so you don't have everyone using the same platform, because if you use the same version of a library or the same platform, you're going to have a monoculture that will eventually cause you issues. And fun. So like building stuff is fun, and it shouldn't be a chore, it shouldn't be draining you. So it's one of those things that you need to balance that with having fun. So this isn't really a official principle, but this is one that I like to mention, because we shouldn't really be forcing people to move to like an IndieWeb platform, or push everyone to say, okay, you know what, I'm no longer using Twitter. If you want to hear my thoughts, you have to go to my website, because chances are people just won't care about my thoughts, if they do anyway. And forcing people to go with like dragged heels doesn't ever work. So what we do have is something called publish on your own site, syndicate elsewhere. So for instance, like when I reply to Twitter, I post it to my website, then my website publishes it out to Twitter, and then that bridges the two, which is why we have a tool called Bridgie, which performs those sorts of bridges between the social web or the indie web and the cyber web. So there are a number of building blocks that support the indie web and that allow you as people to build things, hence building blocks. So one of the really important ones is identity. So having a personal website, you're already owning your identity. Then it's a step further, so using things like microformats to mark up your identity and to let people programmatically understand who you are, understand what your URLs are on other platforms. So for instance, they could automatically say, ooh, okay, here's Jamie's blog, but also he's on Twitter, so I'm going to automatically follow him there when I follow his blog, and things like that. Another important one is posts. I'd say this is like the building block, because if you don't have content, what's the point? This is one that not as many people do, but it's allowing you to quote, say, your posts with a limited character count. So for instance, like in Twitter's 140 characters back in the day, you weren't able to post like a massive long URL as well as text, because each of those characters was very important. So yeah, things like that. Then syndication, so this is either publishing from your own site and putting it onto another platform, or this is the reverse called backfeed, which is if someone's replied to my tweet, which has been published from my website, I want my website to know about that, so it can then render that and say, ooh, this post had a response from so-and-so. Mentions are also very important, because if I were to mention someone else's blog, but I don't tell them that, I'm basically just screaming into the void, and that doesn't really help anyone. So mentions are a way of putting the social in social web. This is a really useful one, and I'm really liking this as a concept. So this is allowing you, instead of having username and password or social login for different things, you instead use your URL to log in, and then that just ties your whole identity together. And instead of someone seeing, okay, well, I'm logging in with Google for Jamie, it's, okay, I've logged in as www.jvt.me, who is presenting as Jamie Tanna. Web actions are still being worked on, but this is like, how do we present the user experience of a discrete action? So liking or replying to a post, how do we present that so it can pop up, say, on their website? So if you're on someone else's website, you can easily reply to it from your own website in the same interface. There's reply context. So we saw this in the example on my website, which had a tweet. So it showed what tweet I was replying to. So you don't just have the text that I was saying. There's a bit of understanding around what was going on there. Then for like any link on the page, showing a preview of it. So that was a few of the building blocks. There's a ton more we could talk about there, but I won't bore you too much. I thought we'd dip a little bit into what is actually in the ecosystem. So we've got a ton of technologies, standards, in development things, fairly stable things that I thought we'd explain a little bit more about. So to start off, there's Microformats. So this is a successor to Microformats 1. And it's a way of using semantic HTML and CSS classes to mark up data in a structured way. It's also really nice because it does this in a way without impacting the human readable side of things. And you can also do things like hide it if it doesn't make sense to show to the user. So this is an example. So the bottom of this is the rendered version of that. And this shows an entry as a container, H entry as an entry that is authored by me. I have this photo. There's an RSVP value. So I am saying, yes, I am going to attend IndieWeb Camp Amsterdam. Now someone could parse that and render that however they wanted. But in the HTML, it's nice. And in a parsed Microformats response, that's also nice because it gets all the right metadata and allows the consumer to put it however they want. So in terms of like producing content, so I used to have a very specific workflow for publishing an article. So I would have my desktop or laptop with Hugo running locally to build my site. I would, of course, use Vim as my editor. I'd write the article, I'd push it to a branch, I'd raise a merge request in GitLab, I'd wait for that to build, I'd check the preview, I'd do a load of other things, there'd be some tests running, then I'd merge it, and then it would take however long to deploy. Now that was fine for something long form like that. But if I needed to do that every time I wanted to say, I like that tweet, I would just, have lost it. So what we've instead got is something called Micropub. Now Microformat exposes a really nice, consistent API for create, read and update and delete of posts. This standard has a ton of consumers. There are a number of big platforms that are starting to use it. There are a number of clients, and due to the way it's built, you can auto-discover bits of config. So your client can expose different things depending on what the server does. And it's a really nice thing. I really love Microformat, and this has been one of my favourite things of working in the IndieWeb, is building stuff with consistent APIs. Next, we have Microsub. So whereas Micropub is all about publishing, Microsub is all about subscribing. So does anyone remember RSS? Now this is because there's probably someone at the back who's shouting, back in my day we had RSS and it was great, but no one used it anymore. So one of the things Microsub is doing is taking things like RSS, the subscribe model, and tweaking it a little bit. So it's a bit more, well, better, and hopefully won't fall upon some of the issues from before. So the Microsub is split into two different distinct things. So there's the server. So the server says, what channels do I have? Like, am I following blogs? Have I got a load of social content? Then in those channels, what content do I have? What's the latest content? Ooh, and what content types am I trying to parse? Do I have something running in the background to update things? And the server does all of that heavy lifting. That then leaves the client to do just the rendering of that content in a way that makes sense to the human person, most likely, who's reading it. So this makes it really nice because you separate the two, so you don't have an RSS reader being both of those. It provides a consistent API, so you can build clients, but you don't have to build the server. Also good. And unlike RSS, there's a load of things built around Microsub in terms of making it a social reader. So things like we're currently looking at re-architecting it around, let me follow this person instead of let me follow this feed, and promoting a bit more of that social conversation around the content. So we mentioned earlier about mentions. So this is the social in social media, and it's how do we discover that someone else has interacted with us. So we won't go into it too much, but you send a request to someone else to say, hey, my post has mentioned your post. That's it. That's the tweet. And that allows someone to know that you have mentioned them. And then they can do something with that. So they could render it, they could just know, they could get a push notification, anything. Then we have Bridgie. So I mentioned before that Bridgie is the bridge to the silo web. There's backfeed to allow you to do things like, ooh, someone mentioned my blog. I'll get a web mention to say someone's mentioned my blog. Alternatively, the other way around, which is syndicating. So I publish a note to my site, and then that syndicates to Twitter. There's web sign-in and Auth, which, as I mentioned before, is the login side of things. So this is taking Auth 2 as a standard and restructuring it in a way that allows everything to be open. So commonly you'll see with Auth 2 platforms that you can't just register or just come up and start interacting with them. You have to register, and sometimes that's an automated process. Sometimes you have to wait for a human person to approve it, which takes time and definitely doesn't scale if you have like hundreds of people who have their personal websites who want to do things. So this is all about rethinking the way that you log in by using your URL. And then there are tools such as IndieLogin, which allow you to do this sort of IndieAuth flow and this open OAuth 2 flow without having to know anything, and by allowing you to authenticate someone or get like an access token to then do things on their behalf in a really nice way, as I say, built on top of a lot of open standards that are existing. So there are a lot of libraries that just work. There's some really good recent work that's made that possible. So this is discovered using metadata on the page, and I'll be happy to talk about it a little bit more later. And again, some example of how to mark up the fact that my GitLab profile is me. So, to wrap up, that was quite a whistle-stop tour. I realised that was a little bit longer than I originally said it was going to be, but I'm glad you've all joined me for this. I've had a lot of fun sharing it. So, to go through, so the IndieWeb, lowercase, is all about having a website on a URL somewhere. Preferably your identity or your name, but it can be a pseudonym, doesn't have to be your legal name or anything representative of yourself, just a URL. The IndieWeb, with caps, is a more political way of what we want to do to replace silos with open social platforms. We also talked about some of the existing tooling, standards, and a lot of the open discussion to support new ways of doing everything in a way that these platforms can't lock us in a way that we can build things that will truly help us. And I know that sounds a little bit like drink the Kool-Aid, and oh yeah, we've got a cool platform, just come over to us. But yeah, do what you think. I have also got some links in terms of getting started. I will drop them in on Slack, and I will also share the link to these slides for those of you that are interested. Thank you very much for your time. I will take questions, but not obviously right now, because I'm recording this a few days early. Thanks very much. See you, folks.